Welcome to While We Were Distracted, the podcast where we explore topics that often get overshadowed in the rush of daily life.
So imagine you are building an American tech company, right?
Okay.
You're paying your taxes, you're following all the laws,
Yeah.
and then you wake up one day to find the Pentagon is legally treating you like, well, a hostile foreign spy network.
Oh, wow. Yeah, that's intense.
Right. You haven't been hacked, you haven't sold state secrets.
Yeah.
But suddenly, you are facing the exact same national security hammer that is usually, reserved strictly for overseas adversaries.
Which is just a massive paradigm shift.
Exactly. And that is the reality the American AI company Anthropic is facing right now.
It really is. I mean, it completely shatters the traditional, I guess you'd call it the geographic map of national security.
Yeah.
We're looking at a regulatory landscape that is crossing this massive uncharted frontier. The tools that were built to keep external threats out are literally being turned inward.
Right. And the implications for domestic innovation there are just staggering.
Absolutely.
Well, welcome to this deep dive. Today we are exploring a really fascinating collision of artificial intelligence, national security, and honestly, the sheer unbridled power of the executive branch.
Yeah, there is a lot to get into.
For sure. So we're pulling from a highly consequential piece of reporting in Politico today by Hassan Ali Kanu. It's titled, Hegseth Doubles Down on Anthropic's Security Risk Designation.
Great article.
It is. And our mission here is to map out this potentially historic shift in how the U.S. government regulates and restricts its own domestic tech companies, specifically focusing on Anthropic and their AI model, Claude.
Right, because the core mystery we have to untangle is the justification.
Exactly. Okay, let's unpack this. Why is an American company building artificial intelligence domestically being subjected to a supply chain risk designation?
Yeah, to understand that, we kind of have to examine the precedent-setting legal architecture that the government is trying to build right now.
Where does that start?
Well, the reporting takes us back to a federal legal panel that heard oral arguments on this very issue in March.
Okay, and just to establish the factual makeup of that panel as it's outlined in our source material, it notably included two appointees of President Donald Trump.
Right.
So that is the setting where this massive shift in legal theory begins to take shape.
Yeah, and that panel indicated during those March arguments that it will likely issue a ruling establishing, and this is a direct quote, sweeping authority for the executive branch.
Sweeping authority. I mean, that phrase alone.
Yeah, it's broad. But the mechanics of what that sweeping authority allows the government to do is where the alarm bells really start ringing for the tech industry.
Because it lets them target anyone.
Basically, yes. It essentially grants the executive branch the power to label domestic companies as supply chain risks.
Okay, we need to unpack the mechanism of a supply chain risk because, that term gets thrown around a lot in defense circles.
It's constantly.
Right. Historically, this specific designation has been a shield used almost exclusively against foreign companies.
Yes, exactly.
We're talking about overseas entities that have documented tangible ties to U.S. adversaries.
Right.
The logic was always directional.
Right. The threat is coming from outside.
Exactly. You prevent a foreign government from baking a vulnerability into hardware or software that is destined for U.S. critical infrastructure.
Because the premise was always based on origin.
Right.
Like if a router or a piece of telecom equipment was manufactured in a jurisdiction controlled by an adversary, the risk was that the adversary could compel the manufacturer to compromise the equipment.
It makes total sense.
Right. So the supply chain risk designation was just the legal mechanism to block that compromised hardware from ever entering the military network.
Which is perfectly logical. But applying that to a domestic company changes the entire paradigm.
It really does.
I think a good way to visualize this mechanism is to imagine being a homeowner, right?
Okay, yeah.
You install this incredibly high-tech alarm system specifically to keep out known neighborhood burglars or foreign adversaries. But now you're taking that exact same alarm system and using it to lock your own family members out of the kitchen.
That is a perfect analogy.
Just completely flipping its purpose. Imagine running a U.S. business, following all the rules, and suddenly facing the exact same security scrutiny as an overseas entity.
It's wild. The legal mechanism built to identify hostile actors is being retrofitted to penalize a domestic company based on a perceived internal vulnerability.
So how does this actually play out? If the government is wielding this sweeping executive authority, how do they justify applying it to Anthropic specifically?
Well, the trigger came on June 3. Pete Hegseth issued a decision that codified this exact logic.
Okay, what did he say?
According to the reporting, Hegseth wrote that the designation of Anthropic as a risk is supported by, and I'm quoting here, pre-deployment risks with the covered entity's products and services, the loss of trust, and other risk factors.
Like the loss of trust.
Yeah. He explicitly states that these elements were, and remain, sufficient to support the prior determination.
The loss of trust. I mean, that phrase is completely jarring when you think about military contracting.
It really is.
It sounds more like a bad breakup than a legal standard for national security.
What's fascinating here is how it highlights a massive friction point between traditional defense procurement and modern artificial intelligence.
How so?
Usually when the Department of Defense evaluates software, they rely on hard, empirical metrics.
Right, like they run penetration tests.
Exactly. Penetration tests, cryptographic audits, they look for exposed API keys, compromised code repositories, specific data breaches.
They look for tangible evidence that a system is vulnerable. You can measure a failed security audit.
Yes.
You can point to a literal line of bad code.
Exactly. But relying on a loss of trust as a foundational legal standard creates this remarkably subjective hurdle.
It's entirely vibes-based.
It really is. If the standard for being labeled a national security threat is simply that an executive branch official has decided they no longer trust you, how does a tech company definitively prove their innocence?
Right. How do you mathematically quantify trustworthiness in a court of law? You can't put trust on a spreadsheet.
You really can't.
And it seems like Anthropic's options to even try and rebuild that trust are just vanishing. Because the reporting notes that the Defense Department has completely closed out Anthropic's request for an internal review.
Yeah, that procedural move by the Pentagon is critical.
Wait, really quickly on that. If the Defense Department has completely closed its internal review, does that mean the door is entirely shut for Anthropic to clear its name internally?
Yes, effectively. By closing the internal review, the Defense Department is shutting the door on any collaborative technical resolution.
So they're forcing this into a purely legal battle.
Precisely. They are actively urging the court to decide on these questions now. They want the judicial system to rubber stamp this sweeping executive authority so they can move forward without having to internally justify their loss of trust to Anthropic.
Wow. So they are forcing this out of the engineering room and into the courtroom?
Yeah. Anthropic is effectively barred from sitting down with the Pentagon's tech teams to clear their name and prove their system is secure.
They just have to fight this unquantifiable emotion in court.
Exactly. And that leads to the underlying catalyst for this entire conflict.
Right. Why did they lose trust in the first place?
Because Anthropic isn't just accepting this subjective label. They are arguing that Hegseth's initial risk designation was sparked by a fundamental mechanical misunderstanding of how their AI model, Claude, actually functions.
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting. This is where the technical mechanics of AI become the center of gravity for the legal argument.
Oh, absolutely.
It boils down to the distinction between pre-deployment and post-deployment capabilities. Let's dissect the mechanism of what the government initially feared.
Sure. According to the source, the government's initial panic was driven by concerns over Anthropic's supposed ability to, and this is a quote, unilaterally manipulate the AI model in real time post-deployment.
Post-deployment, meaning after the AI model has been finalized, sold, and is actively running on secure military servers.
Processing classified information, yeah.
Right. The government believed Anthropic retained, like a master key. They feared Anthropic could theoretically reach into the live system and alter how Claude behaves on the fly.
Like a back door.
Exactly.
The government was terrified that Anthropic could tweak the model's outputs or siphon data while it was deployed in a highly sensitive defense environment.
Which is terrifying, sure.
Yeah, that fear of post-deployment manipulation was the massive red flag that initially shattered the Pentagon's trust.
But Anthropic's counterargument is that this fear is based on science fiction, not their actual engineering.
Right.
I mean, they've stated on the record that they physically do not possess this capability. They cannot unilaterally manipulate Claude post-deployment.
They just don't have the tools to do it.
The architecture of the model just doesn't allow for a secret steering wheel once it's installed on the client's end.
So Anthropic is essentially arguing that the government looked at the architecture of their AI, completely misread the blueprints, and then issued this catastrophic security designation based on a button that literally does not exist.
I mean, if I'm Anthropic, I'm thinking that clearing up that technical misunderstanding should be the end of the story.
You would think.
Right. If the government's entire basis for losing trust was the fear of a post-deployment backdoor, and we prove that backdoor is mathematically impossible, the risk designation should be lifted.
But that is not what happened.
Of course not.
When Anthropic pushed back, Hegseth pivoted. He clarified his position by stating that the supply chain risk designation actually rests on pre-deployment risks associated with Claude,
Rather than the post-deployment manipulation they originally cited.
exactly, the thing Anthropic proved they didn't have.
Okay, we need to push back on that logic because it feels like a massive bait and switch.
It really does.
If the initial loss of trust was sparked by a technical misunderstanding of what Claude could do after it was deployed, how does the government justify maintaining the exact same harsh penalty by simply pivoting the justification to pre-deployment risks?
Well, it's the definition of moving the goalposts.
Yeah, completely.
But to understand the government's pivot, we kind of have to look at the mechanics of what a pre-deployment risk actually is in the context of a large language model.
Okay, explain that for us.
So pre-deployment refers to the entire life cycle of building the AI before it is ever handed over to the client.
Okay.
This includes curating the massive data sets used to train the model, the thousands of hours of reinforcement learning, and, setting billions of internal parameters.
Okay, so going back to our earlier analogy, pre-deployment is like the sourcing of the ingredients, the cleanliness of the kitchen, and the cooking process itself.
Yes.
And post-deployment is just serving the meal at the banquet.
Precisely. And the nature of artificial intelligence makes pre-deployment incredibly murky.
How so?
Because unlike traditional software, where you can read the code line by line to see exactly what it does, an AI model is largely a black box.
Right.
The billions of parameters are set during training. So the government's argument is essentially this. Even if you cannot manipulate the model after it's deployed, we do not have enough visibility into your pre-deployment training process.
Oh, I see.
They're worried about training data poisoning, baked-in biases, or latent vulnerabilities that were introduced before the model was even finalized.
So the government is basically saying, look, we don't trust the kitchen you cooked this in. And because we can't inspect every single ingredient that went into the soup, we are maintaining the security risk designation.
That is the absolute crux of Hegseth's argument.
Wow.
And from Anthropic's perspective, it is infuriating, right? Because the initial accusation was demonstrably false.
Completely.
But from the government's perspective, the black box nature of AI development creates this inherent pre-deployment vulnerability. If they can't mathematically audit the training process, they just fall back on that subjective loss of trust.
But the friction here is immense. The government doesn't need to mathematically prove that Claude is compromised.
Not at all.
Under this sweeping executive authority, they merely need to assert that pre-deployment risks exist in theory, combine that with their subjective loss of trust, and use that cocktail to label a domestic company a national security threat.
Right. If we connect this to the bigger picture, it brings us back to the overarching legal battle being fought in the courts.
Right, because this isn't happening in a vacuum.
Exactly. This technical dispute over pre-deployment versus post-deployment is the test case for how far this executive power can stretch. And that legal panel we discussed at the beginning, they drew a very specific, crucial distinction regarding enforcement.
Right, because having the power to label a company is one thing, but actually destroying their ability to do business is another.
Yeah.
So where did the judges draw the line?
The judges suggested that while the executive branch likely has the sweeping authority to label a company a supply chain risk without much friction, they face a completely different hurdle when it comes to a formal ban. Yeah. If the military or other agencies issue subsequent directives that actively bar or block the use of a company's products, those specific bans can still be challenged in court.
Okay, so what does this all mean? The distinction between the label and the ban is like the ultimate loophole in this regulatory framework.
It really is.
The government can slap a massive neon security risk warning label on a domestic company using a completely subjective standard of trust.
Yeah.
They don't need a trial for that.
Yeah.
But if they try to formally, legally block that company from getting government contracts, the company finally gets to defend itself in front of a judge.
Yes. It creates a bifurcated legal process. The authority to label is treated as this broad, discretionary executive power. The authority to ban triggers judicial review.
Okay.
But, we have to look at the real-world mechanism of how defense contracting actually works. The legal distinction between a label and a ban might be fascinating to lawyers, but the chilling effect it creates in the market is instantaneous and devastating.
Oh, because in the private sector, perception is reality. A label isn't just an administrative note in a file.
Far from it. The defense ecosystem relies heavily on prime contractors, right? These massive aerospace and tech conglomerates that build the overarching systems for the military.
Right.
And those prime contractors hire thousands of subcontractors.
Okay, so if you are a prime contractor looking to integrate an AI model into a new defense platform, and you see that the Pentagon has officially designated Anthropic as a supply chain risk based on a loss of trust.
Your risk compliance team is going to go into absolute overdrive.
Right. You aren't going to sit around and parse the legal nuance of whether it's an executive label or a judicial ban. You're simply going to call Anthropic's competitor.
Exactly. Why take the risk of integrating a component that the Pentagon has already flagged, even if it isn't formally banned yet?
Wow. So the label itself becomes a de facto execution order for a company's market viability in the government sector.
It does. It severely damages a domestic AI company's reputation and revenue stream long before they ever get their day in court to fight a formal ban.
So the government achieves the result of a ban starving the company of contracts without ever having to rigorously prove their case in front of a judge.
They bypass the burden of proof entirely. They don't need an airtight, evidence-based trial showing data poisoning or a compromised code base.
Right. They just need the authority to apply the label, let the chilling effect take hold, and watch the market solve the problem for them.
And that is exactly why the Pentagon is pushing the court to affirm this sweeping authority right now. They understand the power of the label.
They know what they're doing.
Yeah, they know that if the court validates their ability to designate domestic companies as supply chain risks based on subjective trust and pre-deployment black boxes, they have created a fundamentally new lever of power over the American tech industry.
It is a profound shift in the relationship between Silicon Valley and Washington. I mean, just to recap the journey here, we started this deep dive looking at a seemingly administrative legal panel. But the logical through line we've uncovered is massive.
It's huge.
We've gone from the unprecedented legal theory of treating domestic companies like foreign adversaries to the deeply subjective trigger of a loss of trust.
Right, and then we explored the mechanical friction between the government and the tech industry, that wild pivot from post-deployment fears of a backdoor to the murky, unauditable realm of pre-deployment training risks.
And finally, we landed on the brutal reality of the legal loophole. The executive branch's ability to wield a security label as a market weapon, entirely bypassing the need for a formal ban or a day in court.
Yeah.
It fundamentally alters what it means to build critical technology in the United States.
And as we wrap up, I think there is a really important final thought for listeners to consider.
Okay, what is it?
Think about the long-term implications of this precedent on the mechanics of innovation itself.
Yeah.
If a domestic AI developer can be labeled a national supply chain risk based entirely on pre-deployment risks, meaning the danger lies in how the model is built and trained before it ever goes live, how will this force AI companies to fundamentally change their internal development and testing processes?
Oh, wow. Because they know the Pentagon is basically looking over their shoulder long before the product is finished.
Exactly. They have to optimize not just for performance, but for the subjective, unquantifiable metric of government trust during the design phase.
It forces American engineers to build the future while constantly checking the locks on their own doors. I mean, the alarm system we built to secure the perimeter is now just scanning the inside of the house.
That's exactly it.
Well, thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Keep reading, keep exploring, and most importantly, keep questioning the information around you. We'll catch you next time.
Don't forget to like and subscribe for the next episode on While We Were Distracted.